Before we get started, I have a quick favor. I've been self-funding the Finding Genius podcast for 5 years now. I've done over 3,000 episodes. And as you can see on YouTube, we're up over 1 million views on the channel, which is fantastic. The next thing I really want to push on is to get up to 10,000 subscribers. Because once we do, we'll be able to put a donate button and we'll be able to solicit donations to help keep the podcast running and to also get the Finding Genius Foundation moving along. We have a big project studying anxiety, depression, and PTSD and working on a product to help people overcome these problems because I've seen them explode recently after the last 2 years of the whole virus situation. So if you would, please subscribe to the podcast. That would help us tremendously. Give us a thumbs up and check in the description for Buy Me a Coffee. It's about $5. If you could buy me a coffee, I'd really appreciate it. It would help keep the channel going, and I love coffee. Thank you.
Forget frequently asked questions.
Common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
Go above and beyond.
they become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%.
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
With Richard Jacobs.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast. My guest today is Professor Elesha Coffman. She's a professor of history at Baylor University in Texas. We're going to talk about her new book, Turning Points in American Church History, How Pivotal Events Shaped a Nation and a Faith. So I think it'll be a very interesting call, and welcome, Elesha. Thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
Well, then, if you would, just tell me a bit about your background, and how did you end up doing the research that you're doing on, the past activities of the church? Like, where did this come from? What's it about your background?
Yeah, I came a little late to the study of history. All through high school, I thought I hated history. My history teachers were mostly coaches who cared a lot more about the sport they coached than about teaching history. They're not all like that. The ones that I had mostly were. So I studied English literature and communications in undergrad and became a journalist. But early on in my journalistic career, I found myself editing a magazine called Christian History at Christianity Today Publishing. Realized I didn't really know anything about Christian history. I went back down the street to Wheaton College, which is located nearby my undergrad alma mater, to take some more church history classes. My first class there, one of my mentors, Mark Noel, used a book that he had written, Turning Points in Church History, and that book worked great for that class. So then later on, after I got out of journalism, went into a PhD program in American religious history and then started teaching. Came to a place where I wished there were a Turning Points type book for just American church history, a brief enough survey that I could assign it for just a couple of weeks in a class, but that hit a lot of interesting events and went into enough depth in each one that students could get a sense of who was involved, what was at stake and for whom, not just sort of an endless litany of names and dates. And so that was how I got into the field and why I wanted to write this type of book.
Yeah, I think anytime I've heard about church history, it always goes back to the Council of Nicaea, like 300 AD or early church fathers. I just don't know. Maybe there's very little on church history in the past 100, 200, 300 years. So I would think it's a pretty rare subject.
It is less often taught like at the seminary level. That's usually where people are encountering church history, if anywhere at all, which most people don't encounter it anywhere at all. I hadn't all through undergrad until after my undergrad education. The seminary, I did my PhD work at Duke, and Duke Divinity School at the time had 3 church history courses required for people who were training to be pastors. There was early and medieval church history, some of the stuff that you were just mentioning, one on Reformation and modern Europe, and then a whole class on American church history. And since that was the institution where I was being trained, I thought that was normal. And then I found out that it's actually really unusual in a seminary context to have 3 church history classes. When I was teaching at a seminary, we had 2. Early and medieval in the fall, and then Reformation, modern Europe, and U.S. all smashed together in the spring. So that was the specific context for which this book was written. I needed an American church history book that I could cram into the last 2 weeks of that semester. But I knew from my background at Duke that there's a lot of really rich material there. And also it's American church history that's most relevant to the ministry contexts that U.S. pastors are entering, right? They're not preparing to pastor a church in the 3rd century. They're preparing to pastor a church here. And sometimes I would tell them becoming the pastor of a church is a little bit like joining the cast of a very long-running soap opera. A whole lot has happened before you got there. It might be useful to know some of that, some of what you're stepping into. And Nicaea, less relevant there. American church history, very, very relevant.
It makes total sense. So what was it like, the first churches here in the U.S.? What were they like? What were they formed?
There were a number of different types of Christianity that came to different places in what's now the United States at different times. You had Spanish missions and explorations in Florida and coming up from what's now Mexico and the very rich colonies there. English-speaking Americans tend to think of the first churches being the Puritans and the Pilgrims in New England. That's sort of another almost separate founding of Christianity in what's now the United States. These different church efforts, there were also French Catholic missionaries, there were also some Dutch, there were also a little bit later Orthodox coming over from Russia over into the West Coast. Eventually, these church traditions, as well as the nationalities that they were coming from, the sort of imperial powers that they were representing, would collide and crash into each other and have turf wars and questions in the early American colonies being, well, are we going to have one established church for this whole colony, or are we going to allow lots of different churches? Are we going to allow people who aren't members of churches at all? And the different colonies sort of answered that in different ways, so that you had more Puritans in what's now New England, more Anglicans, now Episcopal church that broke off at the American Revolution, more of that in the South, and more of a mixture in the middle.
Hey, interesting. I mean, is it the case that all churches here were established because of religious persecution, or was some established because people of faith came here and they wanted to have a church?
Definitely both. And religious persecution and religious freedom could look a little bit different than we would expect. I mean, the persecution part is maybe more familiar. Restrictions on types of worship, restrictions on where people could be educated, restrictions on making noise in public or doing other things that are considered disruptive. But for, say, the religious freedom that the Puritans were seeking was the freedom to be very strict. They thought that the Church of England was just too lax. There weren't enough sermons. There wasn't enough required participation in church. There wasn't enough oversight of community morality. And they wanted to be able to do all of that in somewhere else, away from the control of the British Crown and the Church of England. But a lot of people, a lot of Europeans came to what's now the United States for economic reasons. And they maybe brought their religious practice with them, or they maybe didn't even care that much about religion. But after there was a critical mass of population in their area, somebody thought that they ought to be more Christianized. Maybe a UK church sent missionaries to where they were especially in the southern colonies. And so religion came after the European colonists rather than with them.
Yeah, very interesting. What happened as different waves of immigrants came to the U.S.? The Irish came, the Polish came, et cetera. How did that change which churches were around and what was preached, and, which denominations were ascendant, I guess?
Right. With the Irish and the Polish, a lot of that, you're talking about the history of Catholicism in the United States. And that's something that I didn't write as much about. I'm a Protestant myself. The press that I was publishing with was Protestant. But the Catholics, different European Catholics had different practices and ideas somewhat about like clergy authority, depending on where they came from. There were some Catholic communities where everything was really centered on the priest. And there were some Catholic communities that there was a lot more of feasts and holidays, or more sort of home-based devotional Catholicism. And in the United States, originally, after it became the nation of the United States, not when there was the French and Spanish colonial tussling for control, but after it became the United States, the Catholic population was relatively small. It was concentrated in first Maryland. That was the one colony that was open to Catholics, and then some other cities on the eastern seaboard as there's more immigration. And often, and this was true of the Orthodox as well, which is a much, much smaller population, immigrants would come here and they would go to a church that was most similar to what they had back home, but it might not be using the same language that they were used to. Outside, the Mass was in Latin, but other talk in church might be a different language. And immigrants would kind of put up with that for a while until there was a large enough population of their ethnic group, their linguistic group, and then they would break off and start their own church. And so you would have some neighborhoods in U.S. cities where you would have practically a Catholic church on every corner. And with the older parish model and a universal Catholic church, that's really not supposed to happen. But in the United States, because of the high rates of immigration, particularly 1880s to 1920s, you would have this anomalous ethnic parish organization. And then as immigration was cut off in the mid-20th century by U.S. laws, and then other patterns of migration and the health of cities changed. That is then part of why you have a lot of Catholic churches and schools being closed in cities now. The overall population has gone down, but you also don't have these really distinct ethnic groups that want to have their own church and their own school. That created a lot of density of institutions in various cities.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Yeah, that's interesting. You're right. The different ethnicities still were closely tied to the language from the country which they came. So I guess services would be in Polish or in Irish or, whatever language, or maybe they were in Latin, for the Catholics. But yeah, I guess that would be a big change over time. Is that what's happened, that services now maybe have all gone to English, but there's still many different denominations?
Within Catholicism, the big change of language was Vatican II in the 1960s. And like you said, a lot of the service was previously in Latin. There's still some Latin masses, but the mass isn't the only thing that goes on at church. There's the education for young people, and there's other kinds of services and prayers and stuff. Remind me of the rest of your question.
Yeah, nowadays, there are so many ethnicities, and they don't seem to be as well, I don't know. I see monument signs for Korean churches, and I guess maybe it's still the same. It's just the different ethnicities from before. Instead of a church where they would speak in, Gaelic or Polish, now it's maybe in Chinese or Korean, and there's a lot of Hispanic churches, and then, plenty in English. So I guess it's still the same. It's just the pattern has shifted. It's still a mosaic, though.
Yes, there are aspects in which each new immigrant group goes through some similar phases when they come to the United States, religiously and culturally. The people who come here are still speaking the language of the country that they came from. Often their children, they are learning English. Sometimes the children then become the translators for the parents for messages back from school and stuff. Sometimes then a third generation will want to recover the language, recover the food ways, recover the holidays. Post-1965, after the immigration law change that opened the United States back up to what turned out to be a new type of immigration, the people who did that policy change had no idea what the magnitude would be of both the number of people coming to the United States and the range of places they were coming from. I think a lot of people in the 60s assumed, we'll just go back to sort of what it was in the early 20th century. We'll have lots of different Europeans. This won't be that big of a change. Well, it has been a huge change. And sometimes the people come to the United States are already Christians. They're bringing church traditions from their home countries. Sometimes they're encountering Christianity here as they're seeking people in their new city who speak their language, who eat the same kind of food, who celebrate the same holidays. Well, those people are congregated in a church. And so that becomes a way for new immigrants to find community, to bridge the old country and the new country, to make connections, either deepening the religious commitments that they already had or possibly forming new ones.
I don't know, what surprised you in your research about church history in the U.S. throughout all these years?
Well, I have chapters starting with the defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 and going all the way to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And I my training was mostly 20th century. So as I was working on the earlier chapters, there was a lot of information, a lot of figures that I should have known more about. And I hadn't met them before. I hadn't paid that much attention to them before. A lot about the early contact between European and different Native American groups, how those stories of encounter, there were some really recurring themes. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of misunderstanding. There was a lot of Native American acceptance of Christianity, and yet that didn't earn them any privileges, that didn't keep them free of violence, that didn't give them citizenship rights, that didn't give them rights to be ordained and lead their own churches. That was, again, it shouldn't have been surprising. I knew sort of the large contours, but I was glad to meet some of those people in greater depth through researching them. People like Samson Occam, who was a member of the Mohegan Nation, converted to Christianity in the early 1700s, and then was a very successful minister who just did not get nearly as much respect as he should have for all the work that he was doing. There were other surprises. The format of the book, each chapter starts with a hymn text and ends with a prayer. And so I had to find a lot of primary sources, do some pretty deep digging there. And that was some of the most interesting and rewarding work for me as a historian who's also a choral music singer. So learning a little bit about the history of songs, trying to imagine what these different church services sounded like, not just what their theology was formally or the portraits of their clergy. I really enjoyed that. And the chapter where I do the most with... go ahead.
Which churches have changed the least throughout all history? Are there any that really haven't changed almost at all?
No, there are aspects of different churches. In terms of liturgy, the prayers and order of service, I think the Orthodox churches have probably changed the least. There's a lot of variety between Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox and the other Orthodox churches that are part of that communion. But the liturgy is central to their tradition in ways that it is less so in Catholicism and way less so in Protestantism. So in terms of church structure and political engagement, the Orthodox churches are in flux as anyone else is. In terms of the hierarchical organization, there's maybe the most stability in the Catholic Church. Protestants are the ones that are the most diverse and changing in every aspect at once all the time.
Okay. Is there any trajectory that, the church body is headed towards that you can see? Or is it just way too diverse to say anything like that? Or are there certain segments that are growing or fading? Like how is it changing literally nowadays?
In the United States now, overall church affiliation is dropping, and the pace of that dropping seems to have increased. Social scientists talk about this as the rise of the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. It's confusing because they don't mean Catholic nuns. They mean that when asked on a survey, what is your religion? They answer none. Throughout the 20th century, European countries had a disaffiliation from Christianity. We'd been seeing those trends. European churches, I don't know if you've traveled to Europe recently, but big churches, nobody in them. Priests still celebrating services to a crowd of no one. And we didn't have that as much in the United States. There was a lot higher rate of religious adherence that peaked in the United States probably in the early 60s. But now the United States has more of the disaffiliation, and it had started in what are known as the mainline Protestant churches, the tend to be a little bit more liberal, a little bit more liturgical Protestant churches like Presbyterian, Episcopalian, but Pentecostal and evangelical churches had continued to grow. Now, evangelical churches like the Southern Baptist Convention are also seeing more disaffiliation, people leaving, fewer baptisms, fewer new members. Pentecostalism and that general family of denominations. Some of them formally recognize each other. Some of them are independent churches, but you would know that they're Pentecostal because there is very ecstatic worship. There's possibly speaking in tongues. There's belief in divine healing, things like that. Those are the ones that are continuing to grow and proliferate. But really across the board, the big story now in American church history is disaffiliation.
Yeah, I would think that, well, it's weird. We have or had mega churches at the same time. So it's a strange dichotomy, I guess. Some are being abandoned totally. Maybe there's, just no evangelism, or, the pastors not getting out there to get more members, while you have mega churches on the other side. It's weird.
That is another thing that has been going on, and I'm glad that you brought that up. There is a greater concentration of people in very large churches. So participation is going down across the board, but also it's a little bit like a Walmart effect. When Walmart started going into small towns, say in the 1990s, the little stores closed because everybody wanted to go to the big store. It was more convenient. It had more services. The sociologist Mark Chaves at Duke, like he was someone that I did a little bit of work with. And so I learned about it from his work. This expectation that church will have something for everyone. It has a nursery and a children's program and a youth group, and it has a worship band that's really dynamic. It's like going to a rock concert. The speaker, the sound system is good. There's an AV system in the sanctuary. If that is the expectation of American churchgoers, and for many, many of them it is, then you're going to be drawn into one of the mega churches. The neighborhood older congregation doesn't have the AV, still uses hymnals instead of a worship band. It just doesn't have the same appeal. Now, for me, I would much rather go to a smaller church with a choir and more formal worship. And there are some people that switch that direction instead, from the very high energy worship to something more liturgical, to something more traditional. But there's been way more movement in the other direction. Bigger, louder, flashier is better.
Yeah, that's weird. It's true. It's strange that it's gone the same way as business, like a consolidation to these fewer, larger entities.
Yeah, Dr. Chaves was trying to track when American churches started to get bigger. Was it about the same time as shopping malls? Was it about the same time as he was comparing it with a lot of different cultural institutions to try to see symphony orchestras? He compared it to at one point, just the like professionalization and the expectations of a certain production value. So there were a lot of changes in American housing patterns going on too. Megachurches benefited from suburbanization for a while. Now there are also urban megachurches, as where the young families live has shifted somewhat. Willow Creek was one of the early megachurches that was in the Chicago suburbs, started in the 80s, I think. And it was a church that started with market research. We will research our neighborhood. What are people looking for? How can we provide what they want? Also, the suburbs were booming. That really helped. Also, there's a lot of demographic segmenting. The church growth movement of the second half of the 20th century, one of the principles of that movement was people like to go to church with other people like them. And so if you want your church to be big, then offer everything that a particular group wants, like young, white, suburban families. So megachurches can be more diverse. It certainly depends on what community they're in, but often they're a lot less diverse than the surrounding community, because the market research formula for growth is pick one demographic and really go after that one.
I guess you would see mega churches that in areas that are more affluent. You'd probably still see a lot more smaller churches, but more of them in poorer neighborhoods.
There's some of that. There's also an urban or suburban / rural distinction. I mean, there are a lot of very small churches in very small communities in the United States. I'm not going to get the math right, I don't think, because that's not really my strong suit, but the median size of a congregation, there are as many congregations smaller than this than bigger than this, is like low 70s. Like there are a lot of very tiny churches, but you can have a lot of very tiny churches, and that still doesn't add up to a whole lot of people. The average churchgoer is going to one of the much bigger churches, so that the average and median size is different. But it's easy to forget the tiny little double-digit membership churches, but there are just a lot of those, particularly away from urban areas, or sort of startup storefront churches in urban areas. And those can be more transient. They come and go. And so they're harder for scholars to track.
Well, how much of the rise of the nuns was it accounted for, the shift from smaller individual churches over to mega churches? Like, does that obscure the numbers of church attendance? Because it would look like, I would guess, maybe a lot of small churches, there's almost no one in them. In the mega churches, there's tons of people. Or like, how reliable do you think are those numbers?
Church, well, there are different things that are measured. If you ask Americans, do you go to church? Do you consider yourself a Christian? Have you gone to church? How many times have you gone to church in the last week? They would, until very recently, overestimate their church participation. This is something that the stats people have known for a long time. If you stood in the back of a congregation and actually took attendance versus if you surveyed that community and asked how many people were in church, people overestimated because that was expected. That was deemed a social good. You were telling on yourself if you admitted that you hadn't gone to church. Some of that social pressure has abated. So one of the theories on why we were seeing this rise of nuns was, well, it wasn't actually changing participation that much. It's just more people were willing to admit that they weren't a church member. They hadn't been to church since Christmas. They didn't really consider themselves a Christian. So that's part of the phenomenon. In terms of trying to get data, you can work from the reported data from churches themselves, and they tend to be pretty good about keeping attendance because they need to know that for budgeting purposes. They need to know that for program planning purposes. That is different than trying to get a snapshot of what the sort of average American churchgoer is experiencing. And that was something the National Congregation Study based at Duke, they figured out a way to do better sampling. They started with random sampling of the population and then asked those people their religious affiliation rather than starting with the church data and trying to find people that way. Again, I'm not enough of a stats person to explain it very well, but the numbers, self-reported data is really squishy. Church-reported data or something like National Congregation Survey is pretty good.
Okay, that makes sense. Any aggregate numbers, the number of people that, went to church at the peak and now?
The Pew research is going to be the best on that, and I would have to look it up. The peak church attendance, like I said, I think it would be roughly 1960s. So this is baby boom. There was a ton of church building right after World War II because people were moving to the suburbs, people were starting families, and there was also a lot of pent-up need. There hadn't been a lot of church construction during the Great Depression or any kind of construction during the Great Depression because nobody had any money. And then World War II, all the resources were diverted to the war effort. So the 50s, there's just this boom in church building and religious school building across the country. There was a certain amount of if you build it, they will come. As supply of religion increased, so did demand. Then when there was shifting population, aging population, later getting the more disaffiliation, there would be a mismatch between this big church that was built for a neighborhood in the 1950s, which 2 decades later, again, with church growth movement, assuming that people want to go to church with people who look like themselves. When a neighborhood changed, it was very difficult for churches to change with them. If a neighborhood went from mostly white to mostly Black or Hispanic, probably that same church, it was either going to relocate further out into the suburbs where its white congregation was, or maybe the building would be sold to a new church. So as population trends changed, a lot of individual congregations really struggled, and then whole denominations struggled. So the overall, both the percentage affiliation and pure numbers of churchgoers any week is down now. But like I said, I'd have to look up the numbers.
Yeah, that's interesting, though, the phenomenon you just talked about. You're right. If the ethnicity of a neighborhood changes, right, how does the church accommodate it? Can they accommodate it? If there's a lot of newcomers that are different, are the people there going to say, get out of here or not welcome them? Very, very interesting.
It's been really hard. And sometimes churches will start then another congregation, like you'll see a church that has English language services and then one Spanish language service or one Korean language service. So it's almost like 2 congregations inhabiting the same building. But yeah, it's really, really hard. It's really hard for churches as institutions or Christians as churchgoers to adapt to population change.
Just like now with, the rise of LGBTQ type stuff. And, I see some churches accommodating, some churches not. That's another shift that seems to be occurring, over the past maybe 5 to 7 years, maybe 10 years.
Yeah, different denominations, different Protestant denominations have been addressing that. Episcopal Church was kind of early on that with gay bishop. I believe that was back in the 90s. Presbyterians have had a lot of discussions and some splits about that. Most recently, United Methodists, which was a very big denomination, bigger, more conservative denominations, not dealing with it as openly or as much at a national level, but you will see it at, say, religiously affiliated colleges. Younger generations tend to be much more open on LGBTQ issues, in part because they have friends who identify as LGBTQ, or they don't remember a country before gay marriage was legal in all states. But at an institution like a church or like a religious college, it's not the young people who hold the power. It's an older generation. So you'll get generational conflicts over LGBTQ much more than racial or ethnic identification.
Yeah, very interesting. So what has all this study, do you think, given you? Like, how has it changed your perspective? I don't know if you're pastoring or if you just attend or, other pastors that, have read your book or have studied church history more. How do you see that it changes people's perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And starting to study church history, like I said, after undergraduate, it has led to very big changes in my outlook and my own religious participation. I grew up evangelical. I grew up in a very small town in central Indiana, a little town without a stoplight, had a lot of different churches, did not have a stoplight, had almost no racial or ethnic diversity. And for cultural and religious reasons, I just sort of assumed that there was one way to do things. There was one way to be a Christian. There was one way to read the Bible. There was one way to be a citizen in the country. And then through getting more education and then really starting to learn church history, realizing people who identified as Christians, who I would see as part of the church writ large across time and space, had really different approaches. They did not all think the Bible said the same thing. When they had a question about a particular issue, they didn't all even look to the same passages for guidance. They looked to completely different books of the Bible. They thought that something else was really important coming out of the biblical message. Church organization had been really different, and it didn't always move in a linear direction. A church might have female clergy early in its history and then deny women the right to be clergy and then give it back to them later. It wasn't just a steady march in the direction of more diversity and freedom. These things can go sort of forwards and backwards. The people who were most like me in church history, for American church history, white English-speaking Protestants, they were often the villains rather than the heroes in these different stories. So realizing not just diversity, there's also, of course, diversity of religions. There are lots of people who are not Christians in the United States, and that kind of diversity is obviously really important to recognize. But even within Christian history, even within the church, there's difference and debate, and there isn't just one right way to do much of anything. That really opened my horizons, made me more curious about the world, less defensive, more open to change in my own life, change around me. I think there's a lot of humility that should be cultivated in studying either church history or any kind of history when you realize your way is not the only way to do things.
Well, how much of a history repeats itself or rhymes with itself phenomenon are you seeing with studying churches in the U.S. throughout the past 260, 70 years? Is there a cycle that keeps repeating, or is it just it's changing without any discernible or repeating pattern?
There are some cycles. Like I said earlier, with immigration, there are some familiar patterns that immigrant communities go through, whether you're first generation immigrant in 1880 or 1910 or 1970, some similarities there. There are also some things that change, technology, transportation. How much are you aware of what's going on very far from your community? How fast does word travel? There are some storylines. Every instance of religious revival, the coverage of that is going to be very similar to coverage of Christian revivals, at least as far back as the early 1700s, what's now known as the First Great Awakening. That I'll kind of roll my eyes at as a historian. There's just certain patterns that people expect to follow. There will be these great meetings, there will be emotional outpourings, and then there will be social change for the good that follows it. Well, the pattern is more the expectation than what actually happens. And there are some underlying tensions that they don't cycle, they just never go away. Individualism versus a sort of communal outlook. What is meant by religious freedom and what are the limits of that? What happens when people read the Bible differently and they can't agree on it? How do Christians relate to people who are not Christians? You can see versions of that. Now we're going to have the 10 Commandments in school, in classrooms in Louisiana, or teach the Bible in classes in Oklahoma. I've been doing a lot of research on the middle of the 20th century through looking at the Archives of Religion News Service. And I feel like we've seen all this before. I can show you the articles from the 1950s. We've had exactly this argument. No, I don't know whether it's going to turn out the same or not, but those same fundamental tensions that are built into our religious structures in the United States, they don't really go away. They keep coming back and under slightly different guises, slightly different fights.
Have you seen a place that the United States hasn't gone that other nations, that have Christian churches, Catholic churches has gone?
The United States, some of the colonies had established churches that were even more closely allied with the state, were funded by the state, tax funded. That's something that beyond the colonial level, we never had in the United States. Some states still had vestigial established churches. I think Massachusetts might have been the last one to phase that out in the maybe 1820s. So there are aspects of church-state alignment that are common or expected in other parts of the world, much of Europe, certainly Russia, that we haven't had in the United States. And you can interpret some of the Christian nationalism now as an argument that we ought to have that we ought to have, say, the Bible in public schools, the Ten Commandments on the wall, that we ought to have only the right kind of Christians in positions of political power. We have not seen that be very successful in the United States. I personally hope it is not successful now. We also have then seen secularization in Europe. Just people, there being very little expectation that anyone would go to church, rather surprised that someone does. That could happen here. And you could also get both. You could get a decrease in overall religious participation and an increase within that smaller religious population, the expectation that church and state ought to be fused even more tightly together. I think we are seeing both of those trends right now, and they would seem to be pulling in opposite directions. I'm not sure what we're going to end up from that fight here.
Yeah, I had heard, I guess in China and North Korea, there's like huge underground movements where, the Christian faith is growing like crazy. I'm not sure about the rest of the world, but at least those two places, from what I've seen on, some documentaries, that's what's happening. Are there any big movements here in the U.S., either towards or away? Is the acceleration away from the church growing, or are there other movements where it's coming back? Like, what are the dynamics of today?
The overall trend is toward disaffiliation. We don't have underground churches in the same way because most types of religious expression can be out in the open, even ones that would seem pretty fringe or extreme. There's a church not far from me here in Waco where the assault rifle is one of their central icons. Like, that would seem to be pretty far out, but they have a website. They're not underground. You can find them. The non-denominational churches, that has been rising. Congregations that are not organizationally or financially tied to any other congregation. That's been growing for a while, but I think that's an even larger percentage of American churches. So not just a disaffiliation from church, but even a disaffiliation of churches from denominations and other structures. And you can get a lot of growth that way. It's very entrepreneurial. It tends to be a very dynamic leader, often a very dynamic worship band as well. It can grow really quickly. Those stories can also go really badly because if there's some kind of abuse of power, sexual abuse, financial shenanigans, there's nobody else keeping track of that. There's no check on the power of the dynamic leader who founded that congregation. Or even if it doesn't get racked by scandal, it's hard to have a succession plan there because it was the one dynamic leader who took that congregation from nothing to huge. There isn't a tradition behind, it's usually a hymn, that's training up more pastors in that lineage or is going to help that congregation with the transition from one pastor to the next. So some of the big scandals that you see, the Mars Hill Church would be an example, the podcast series from Christianity Today, The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, that is an emblematic story of how the entrepreneurial strain of American Christianity can get really big and also go really bad.
Is are Unitarian churches a new invention, U.S. only, or, these like hybrid denominations, or I don't even know what you'd call them. Like, again, is that a recent American only type thing?
No, Unitarians have been around for a long time. There were Unitarians in the American colonies. The Unitarians were very prominent at Harvard, and that was why some other schools were founded because other Christians thought that Harvard had gone too Unitarian. There are Unitarians. I know in the Czech Republic, a friend of mine is a Unitarian historian and clergywoman, and she travels sometimes around the world. Some affinity with sort of deistic traditions, Enlightenment traditions in Europe. Unitarians are not a big movement. Unitarians and Universalists I don't know, like, so the UUs, I don't know if the Unitarians outside the U.S. are as often allied with Universalists. That's a branch of church history I don't know that well. Also in the mix in the United States are the spiritual but not religious. Before social scientists were talking about the nuns all the time, N-O-N-E-S, the big conversation was spiritual but not religious. People who, when asked, are you a spiritual person? Yes, absolutely. Do you go to a church? No, but I like yoga and I pray. I believe in God. I read a lot of religious literature. I will sometimes listen to a Christian radio station, it would be derided as a cafeteria style faith, taking pieces of different traditions and putting them together. But for the people who that was their religious expression, that was very, very important to them. And the Unitarian Universalist tradition has some overlap with that spiritual but not religious. I will read religious texts from all the different religions. And I would also like to get together with like-minded people and have a religious service and share a meal afterward.
Now that the book is out, any interesting feedback that you're getting from people that are reading it, or is it not yet published? Just gotten my copy, so I didn't know if it was an advanced copy or not, but thank you, by the way.
Oh, yeah, you're welcome. It came out in January, and so there are some folks who have been reading it. I've done some other interviews about it. I'm really hoping that some instructors will use it in classes. Obviously that you get a lot of book sales that way, but also I wrote it because I needed it for my own teaching context. I'm in a different teaching position now. I don't teach U.S. church history in the same way anymore, so I'm not going to be using it in any of my classes. But I know that Mark Knoll's Turning Points book worked really well for teaching, and one of the reasons that it worked well, his was Turning Points in Church History, like from Acts all the way to today. Students got to see in each chapter how a historian made choices to say, this is what happened, this is why it was important, this was how it related to what went before, this was how it related to what went after. So you're teaching some of the skills of historical thinking, not just historical content. Memorize this stuff because it is the truth and I will teach it to you. So I would love it if readers, either who are using my Turning Points book in churches or classrooms or just on their own, imagine after you've read my choices of 13 turning points, what else would you nominate? How would you make a historical argument for this other event being really significant? So if they're thinking like historians and not just knowing some stuff about history, that would make me really happy.
So how has it changed how pastor? Have you figured that out, or have you observed the change from?
I don't know this book specifically. I've gotten a few pieces of feedback from pastors, and several of the people who have reached out for podcast interviews are clergy themselves. And so they just read the book and they're starting to think through how it might change their ministry. I do know from when I taught in seminary, the effect of learning the sweep of church history for those students was similar as it was for me, realizing, oh, there's different ways to do this. Oh, if I have run into a problem in my congregation, maybe my denomination has some resources for thinking through that, or maybe I can find resources somewhere else in church history. Maybe there was someone in the past who wrote about this in a way that's really helpful. Maybe there's someone from a really different church tradition who wrote about this. I'm a Protestant, but this Catholic has really good ideas, for example. So I would hope that pastors could use this book in their churches. A lot of the tensions that American congregations are experiencing over politics, over LGBTQ inclusion and other kinds of gender issues. I would hope that rather than getting in really heated back against the wall fights over maybe biblical interpretation, it might be helpful for pastors to say, well, there's a bigger context here. There are reasons why people might fall on one side or the other of this issue. Maybe if we look at how it played out in other people's lives, that will help us to have a perspective on the story rather than necessarily putting ourselves and our own feelings at the center of it. Maybe that's too big of an ask, but I would hope that this would be a resource for pastors trying to understand, why is my church the way it is? Why is my neighborhood the way it is? This fight that my people are having, is that one that we've had before? Sometimes when I taught at seminary, in addition to the long-running soap opera, I would say to students, Church history is kind of your lab course. You're learning theology, you're learning biblical studies in other classes, these sort of abstract concepts. If you want to know, well, what happens when a church believes that way or structures itself that way? How does that play out? How does that experiment run? Well, you can probably find something in church history that shows you if we make these choices, these are the problems that it solves, and these are the new problems that it creates. It's not just you facing those problems. Those are long-running problems. It's not your fault. It's not your congregation's fault. This is just tough. And here are some resources that might help you move forward.
Okay, well, very good. Well, Elesha, what's the best way for people to find out more about your work? As I would say, get the book. So is it on Amazon and everywhere books are sold, or how can they get it, first of all?
Yeah, Turning Points in American Church History is everywhere books are sold, and there's an audiobook version for people who prefer that.
Okay, well, very good. Any other ways people could follow up and find out more about your work and your upcoming work?
Yeah, I don't do a lot of social media, but my faculty page at Baylor University is pretty well updated. I'm just starting to roll out some work on the new research on religion news service. So I'm hoping that some of that will get some wider traction, but you never know as an academic. So it'll be coming, just it'll take a while.
Okay, well, very good. Well, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.